Nice to see all of you. I hope everybody is doing well in their various COVID environments. My big change over the weekend was to change the wall that is my backdrop in my office because I was so sick of my old one. It's like that's considered exciting. Um, so let me just set the stage a little bit, and then I'm going to take you through some slides that I put together, but also this interactive tool that we have. But let's do this as always, where you guys jump in all throughout this. So let's not wait for questions and answers. Like if you have any thoughts, please jump right in. So, as you guys hopefully know, I run a bipartisan organization, cares about fiscal responsibility. I kind of define fiscal responsibility as using debt in ways that reflect your economic objectives, not your political objectives. So it's not a balanced budget group. It's not a small or big government group. You can be big government fiscally responsible, small government fiscally responsible. It's the attempt to push back on the general political desire to borrow to pay for things because it's much more fun than actually paying for them, and as a result that pushes the responsibility onto the future and has longer term negative economic ramifications. So it's a little nuanced for a bumper sticker, but it's not an overly simplistic mission. In keeping with that, one of the reasons that you do want to borrow is when you're in an economic crisis or an emergency. So we are now in the midst of a huge moment, which is exactly when you should be borrowing. And there's an irony in all of this, which is that the political environment always seems to wake up. First off, politicians tend to be fiscally responsible when they're playing defense, meaning when they're trying to keep the other guys from their proposed agenda. They all find fiscal responsibility. Then as soon as they have the opportunity to push their own agenda, borrowing is just perfect because it will pay for itself, or its investment, or deficits don't matter. But one of the problems is that people use it as defense. But the other problem is that when the eye-popping headline numbers get really huge like they are right now, people start saying, oh my God, the debt is huge, we can't borrow. When that's not the right way to think about it. It is true that it is much more complicated borrowing in a time when you're already over indebted, which we were. But what this really is, other than a terrible crisis and tragedy on so many real fronts, is it is a reminder of why we should have entered this moment. Sorry, the new room has really weird sun shadows on my face. I feel like it's a little bit of modern art, so I keep ducking around it. But it's a reminder of why we shouldn't have been borrowing so much when the economy was expanding for the 5 years prior to this. The president signed into law and Congress passed almost $5 trillion in new borrowing when the economy was strong. That made no sense. And what it does is it means that as a result, we enter this crisis with a much worse debt situation, which will lead to more damage because we have to borrow so much. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't borrow. We should continue to borrow. You want it to follow the basic 3 T's of recessionary spending, which is timely, temporary, and targeted. I think untimely so far, they did a really good job in the beginning, passing a bunch of bills that got done really quickly and with bipartisan support. Now, not so much. We're missing a lot of deadlines at the end of the fiscal year and the end of the unemployment benefit bump up. So it's not as timely as it was, but they did a good job of that in the beginning. Temporary for the most part, absolutely. Though when the president does the talk about an executive order that he is making a temporary payroll tax cut, but he'd like to make it permanent, that is exactly the opposite of that T. But I think the most important T for this moment is really starting to think about targeted, in that we had to spend a whole lot of money quickly to get out the door. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to give it to people who don't need it. There are going to be juicy stories of companies that took PPP loans that shouldn't have, and it's distasteful. But that's not the point. The point is you want to blanket the dollars out there, get them quickly. But now that we've had more time, if Congress and the White House were functioning bodies, that the general theory that I push these days is that it's not, and that's part of the reasons our fiscal situation is so bad. But we would have used this time to really figure out how to target the measures that we do need now. So that's where we are. And then the third piece of this, though, is that ultimately we will come out of this so indebted. We're going to have to do much, much more to get the debt under control once the economy is strong again. There's one effort that I'm really supportive of and participating with, which is 60 members in the House of Representatives, led by Jody Arrington of Texas and Scott Peters of California, where 30 Republicans, 30 Democrats, how often do you see that these days on actual real things, are pushing for the notion that future economic stimulus measures, which are necessary, would also have with them some kind of a mechanism that, even if it doesn't lock you into it, would signify or signal the belief that once the economy's strong again, we should do something to deal with the national debt then. Because this really is a three-part response. Get control of the virus, fight the recession, and then bring the debt back down to where it's sustainable. So let me just go over where we are in general, which is one of the most notable things about this recession is just how massively fast the onset was. And this, of course, is because it wasn't kind of the slow demise of the economy that often has in the normal business cycle. It's because we shut the economy down. And so the huge jump in loss in GDP, unemployment, all of those things makes complete sense because of the type of recession this was. I forget if I talked to all of you about this before, but we knew that there'd be a recession because we were in a period where it was like the longest expansion ever. So as a fiscal group, we were trying to think, how do we prepare for this? And we wrote a report called Break the Glass, where it was just suggesting a model that when the next recession came along, we would have lots of stimulus measures, and we gave a bunch of examples of what they might be, and that you would actually tie them with long-term offsets. So that if you had rebates for people in the longer term, you would have a surtax that offset the cost that kicked in once the economy is strong. Again, that's kind of what that letter 60 is asking for. If you have unemployment benefits going up, you would have unemployment system reforms that would help recoup that money, again, kicking in once the economy is strong. And I remember I had this discussion of like, do we need to think about the different kinds of recessions that it might be? You know, would it be a terrorist attack? Would it be normal business cycle, stock market popping? And our basic and completely incorrect take on it was, no, in the end, they'll all be pretty similar. And this, of course, is a completely different kind of recession than what any of us were envisioning, because we actually stopped all of this production, anything that you had to be there in person to do. And then another effect of it that was so surprising was that we were doing such a good, successful job at the beginning of getting money into people's hands that incomes actually went up in the early months of the recession, despite the huge job loss. And so consumption wasn't really harmed nearly as much as it would be, but it certainly shifted to where it was. For instance, mine, 100% Amazon, and I'm betting I'm not the only person who it's changed. I got to dig into, maybe one of you could do this for me, but do a whole story digging into the revenues and profits of Amazon during the downturn, because it must be just staggering how much that's changed. Actually, I have tons of stories ideas too, all sorts of things that I've been thinking about that I thought, I should write an op-ed or do something and haven't had the time or the research to do. So anybody is welcome to follow up with me if you want various story ideas on what's interesting about this recession. Interesting is also probably an insensitive word given how truly devastating it is. But I mean, the economic issues that will last, which would be useful to start thinking about. Okay, so we built a tool, and it's on the front page of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's website, called COVID Money Tracker. And I'm really excited about this because it is so filled with data. Like, you can search it for hours. We just had our staff meeting this morning, and our head of policy was saying, you know, I am on this thing for hours at a time, and I'm just trying to figure out, is it just because I'm a nerd, or is it really that exciting to everybody? But as a bunch of nerds at the office, we all think it's really exciting. And I'll show it to you right now, just very quickly. Let me see if I find it. So when you go to our website, you can go on and you can just click on any of these pieces. So as you know, there's a bunch of different parts that ways that money has been spent as a response. There's the Federal Reserve that has put a ton of money in. Chris, are you trying to jump in?
Yeah. Are you trying to show a screen right now?
Yeah, you don't see it?
We're still on the slideshow.
Really? Oh, maybe you can't click around to other things. Okay, then I'll switch out and I'll show it to you later. Darn, I was giving you like this whole starburst cool experiment. Glad you told me that you weren't seeing it. So you could go on and you could see how you can search the different areas of administrative action, legislative action, or Federal Reserve action. This slide shows you one table, but what's really fun to play with is this, which is our Starburst tool. And I guess I can't take you through it in person at the same time that I do the PowerPoint, but if you click on Fed or you click on legislative actions, you can then start searching by anything, like what industries have received money, how do you compare different states, how much of it is tax policy versus healthcare, and certainly just trying to keep all of these numbers in our heads and try to understand how much money is out in the economy, how much will be paid back. If you go to this one, the earlier chart, you can see how much has been dispersed, how much has been approved, and we also have a table that shows what the ultimate effect on the deficit will be in all these different areas, and you can break it out in incredible detail. So COVID Money Tracker, I really recommend to you guys. There's also an interactive table that I find sometimes simpler, just when I'm trying to pull up the numbers. And very important, I assume you guys will want this if this is related to a beat that you're on, but we send out a weekly update to a bunch of people. It's not public, but we share it with media, of any changes that have happened in the past week on stimulus dollars. So if you're interested in being on the receiving end of that little newsletter, just shoot me an email, MacGuineas@crfb.org, and I will put you on our list for it. But it's a great way to keep track of all the changes that are going on. So again, the COVID Money Tracker just allows you to really explore the data. If you are searching for pieces to write, there are endless possibilities on all of this. In addition to tracking all the data in terms of where it is being spent, how it's improved, how much has made its way into the economy, we also do one-off research projects of our own. So how much money has gone to public schools versus private schools, something I was really interested in. How much different kinds of healthcare spending. So you can pull up all those reports on our website as well. So one of the interesting things, context about this whole response, is that we actually, as a share of GDP, have put about as much money into the economy as we did in the last crisis, the crisis of 2008, 2009. The difference is, you can see it's about 2.3, 2.4% of GDP. The difference is that the last time around, that money was put into the economy over a period of 5 years, whereas this time it was put in basically in 5 months. So never before have we just thrown so much money into the economy so quickly. And I think the big story now is going to be, are we done? Where's it going? I had just assumed we would have had another stimulus bill, certainly by this point, and obviously in my mind, certainly before the election. So it caught me off guard that it looks as though that may not happen. And it seems like there's probably less need in some areas than we might have thought there was, but surely there's going to need to be more to keep the economy from going back into a free fall, into massive GDP declines.
Maya, could I ask a question on that slide there?
Yeah, sure thing.
In years 3, 4, and 5, the COVID response goes negative. What does that mean? Is that loans
So
coming?
some of that money will be paid back. So if you took a loan, repayments will be coming back in. So that's why the deficit effect of all of this is actually going to be less than the money that was allocated or approved to be spent, because there'll be lots of repayments. The other thing is, this of course assumes no further bills. There will be some. So the one thing that we know about this chart is that it's wrong, but this is just what Congressional Budget Office, my Bible of an institution, looks at the dollars that have already been put into, have been passed legislatively or administratively, and then they project out from there. But as there are additional bills passed, this will get much larger in future years. Okay, so with all that, the fiscal situation, absolutely terrible. No surprise. Like I said, it shouldn't serve as a budget constraint at the moment. It shouldn't be that we just stop borrowing because we're so worried about the debt. But we have to realize that this situation is really bad and still has all the potentially negative effects of having excessive levels of debt. And just, I'll hit on those. So when your debt is due, like it's a big question. People, especially with this day and age where so many people are sort of coming up with stories for why deficits don't matter, but it's worth putting out reminders of why they do. Excessively high deficits have negative effects on economic growth that can come through a lot of different transmittals in the economy. But it's particularly damaging to us as a country right now because we already are going to be hampered in terms of economic growth by the aging of the population. As the baby boomers are moving by thousands and thousands a day into retirement, that's kind of hitting us in two ways. It's going to hurt us in terms of economic output, GDP, and our labor force isn't going to be growing nearly as quickly as it did as when the baby boomers were in their working years and growing the economy massively through the labor contribution. And it's also going to be hitting us in terms of the huge dollar amounts that go out to them. We spend $6 per senior on every $1 that we spend on people under 18 at the federal level. And those entitlement programs, which are our biggest programs, Social Security and Medicare, as they're absorbing more people, they already grow faster than the economy. But as they're growing faster than the economy with an expanding population, more and more resources will go to those programs. And so all of that is going to be like a wet blanket on GDP growth, and you don't want to have an excessive debt that's hurting that as well. Second reason that one worries about is it squeezes out other parts of the budget when you're paying a chunk of your money on interest payments. It's never a great use, as I'll show you in a minute. It's less damaging to your economy when that's being financed domestically. Like in Japan, they have a huge debt and it's financed pretty much all domestically. In the US, we depend an awful lot on foreign lending to finance our spending. Domestic saving has been going up recently. Again, it's because a lot of people's incomes actually didn't decline, and there's a lot fewer things to spend money on. So domestic savings is higher right now, but one presumes that won't last beyond this downturn and will continue to be dependent on foreign borrowing. That means your economy doesn't have the standard of living growing as fast as it would otherwise. Third reason you care about deficits, one cares about deficits, is so that when you go into a moment like this, a crisis, you are more prepared. Hopefully your debt is at a healthy level. If it's grown during recessions and come down relative to GDP during expansions, you're in pretty good shape. It's just that our deficit grows at all points in the business cycle these days. And then finally, I think one of the biggest problems about the deficit these days is that it's really keeping us from having, this moment, this crisis aside, big conversations about the massive changes going on in our economy, in our country, in our world, stemming from globalization and technological change. And we should be building an entirely new social contract. We have a social contract that was built for last century. It is almost purely about seniors, healthcare, and retirement, when what we should be having is things that think about insurances for all the different kinds of professional risks that exist. Lifelong learning, because nobody's going to be finished learning, just after college or graduate school or anything. You're going to have to keep learning all throughout. Huge dislocations that will take place in the economy, automation, the future of work. We should be having a social contract that's contemplating those kinds of changes, but our excessive debt, I think, kind of stops that conversation short before it even gets begun. And then ultimately, it leads you into real problems that could create a crisis, whether it's through mechanisms like inflation or currency, your role of your currency. And so that's why one worries about the debt. Where we are now is that our deficit this year will be about $3.3 trillion. It was supposed to have been a little bit under $1 trillion. CBO is estimating that comes down, but again, it will all really depend on whether we have further recovery funds that are put into the economy. The debt also will reach record levels. The debt we have been expecting the debt to reach 100% of GDP in around 2030, but now this will happen next year. So it's massively sped up the period where the debt is going to eclipse the size of the economy, and then in a couple of years, by about 2023, it's going to actually break the national record that we have. The only time the debt was higher than it is now as a share of the economy was right after World War II, and we will now get past that in a couple of years. So it shows you just how quickly the debt levels can change. Like 2008, 2009, our debt as a share of the economy grew massively, and like I said, we never brought it back down afterwards. And here you have another jump up. So when people sort of picture the debt trajectory that you're on, which is already unsustainable and that it's growing faster than the economy, you then have to stop and realize it can actually massively increase due to unforeseen circumstances, which is what's happening right now. And then, as you can see, just structurally, even once we get out of this and things return to quote unquote normal, we are structurally at the point where our deficits are very significant. We are basically dependent on borrowing, and as a result, dependent on low interest rates in order to finance the level of spending that we tend to stick to in this country. And there's no signs of that abating without a big debt deal, which, because of our politics, is very difficult. Potential story here, but all of the major trust funds are facing insolvency in a relatively short amount of time. You can see that the Highway Trust Fund is going to be running out of funds next year, with Medicare, hospital insurance, and Social Security disability not far behind, and Social Security, within just over a decade. All of these situations have deteriorated because of declining revenues. One of my favorite bills that's out there is Mitt Romney, bipartisan, bicameral with Joe Manchin and folks in the House, but the Trust Act, which basically says if there is a dedicated trust fund that is projected to become insolvent within 15 years, there should be a bipartisan group of members that's appointed to try to come up with solutions for that trust fund on its own. So don't try to fix the entire debt all at once. That's probably too heavy a lift. So that you'd have a recommendation that says, like, this is what we should do to address this program that is that trust funds are running low. Because it's crazy. Sometimes I'll be talking to members of Congress and they're like, Medicare, it's not like there's nothing, we don't do anything with, we don't oversee that. And you're like, but you do, because it's not a part of the appropriations process. So many of these programs where the committees of jurisdiction, this is all on the record, so I won't say what I think of how they neglect the fact that you need to address these programs, but it's terrible that they just go unaddressed year after year. Members don't even have the sense of the necessary oversight, and so something like the Trust Act would really help to create that. And I know I just started writing an op-ed this morning on how Social Security is demagogued so terribly in elections, and in fact in this one by both sides. And I just to put out there, it is so pure and simple that Social Security, of the biggest one, the one that's most demagogued, the trustees tell us every single year, the program does not have sufficient revenue to pay the benefits that we've promised. There should be no argument about the need to fix Social Security. Where there should be plenty of argument is over how to fix it, right? You can do it all through revenues. You can do it all through benefit changes. You could do it through a combination of both. You could take money from other parts of the budget, put it in Social Security. There's many, many options. So honestly, there's really only about a bucket of 5 that make a whole lot of sense. But we can have plenty of disagreement for ideological, political, generational reasons about what the fix should be, but it should not be acceptable to say that we don't have to do anything on Social Security, because we have known that it won't be able to pay the full benefits for decades. And because politicians prefer to demagogue on it than fix it, we get this really, really irresponsible scaremongering all the time, but particularly during elections. So I'll just put that out there, that Social Security, the notion that you're not going to have to make changes to Social Security is just couldn't be more at odds with the impartial trustees who run the program. That's the result of a frustration of having written my master's thesis about 1 million years ago on ways to finance and to improve Social Security, and have watched us do nothing for so many years. And honestly, it is because politicians would rather have it as a criticism of each other. Okay, just about finished here, but one really interesting thing to keep an eye on is how the Fed and fiscal policy, monetary fiscal policy, are much more entwined than ever before. I hope, if this is related to your beat, you all watch the Jackson Hole meetings online, which were really interesting. They are always filled with tremendous research and thoughtful discussion. But their new statement about how they're looking at inflation is very important and going to play a real role in thinking about fiscal policy as well. But one of the things to note is that the Fed has played a role in purchasing the Treasury. So we're obviously auctioning off many more Treasuries as we're financing a larger budget deficit. And the Fed has purchased a lot of them. Oops, not there yet. Which, I'll go to this one. in the first months of the crisis, the Fed was actually buying an equivalent amount of treasuries as we were issuing. I don't think it was for the purpose of absorbing our entire deficit. It was to create more liquidity in the markets, but it happened that it was the same amount. Now the Federal Reserve's new purchases has declined somewhat, and more of that is being filled, as I mentioned before, by domestic holdings, which has really gone up. But it won't be like that forever. And when you have a lowering of demand for the treasuries, that pushes up interest rates, that crowds out other public investment, that has a negative effect on the economy. Last point I'll just make is that our GDP is likely never to return to where it was before. It won't bounce back up and we won't get on the same track as we were before. So you can just see this, the amount between those two lines is the overall loss of GDP that we'll have over time. So it's important to remember that it's not just like in the 6 months or 1 year of a recession where you're being harmed. You're on a lower path thereafter. And so that has real effects in the overall pie, the economy pie, which we then can proceed to argue about how we should distribute it. But a large pie is always at least gives you more resources to figure out how to distribute them. So with that, I'm going to, if I can figure out how to get out of this and return to you guys. No one interrupted with questions. I hope you have questions now.
Okay, y'all have questions?
You talk about sort of getting to 100% of GDP. Is that when, because I feel like the debt as a public policy issue doesn't become an issue until it becomes harder for the government to borrow, right? Or are there other sort of telltale signs that we should be looking for as when this becomes a practical issue beyond just like trust fund insolvency?
Yeah, it is a great point. It's actually one of the tricky things about all this because 100% is a big headline number. It's like having a deficit of zero. It's like a simple number that you can understand. And when we hit 100%, people write stories about it. But actually, it has no economic meaning. It doesn't matter whether you're at 99, 101, or something completely different. In this world where you're trying to get people to pay attention, for me as an advocacy person, I look at moments that people will wake up and pay attention. It's like the deficit hits $1 trillion. That is a wake-up moment, but it doesn't have any economic importance. The economic importance here is two things. It's gradual, like the frog in the boiling water, which is whenever you have more debt, and particularly more debt that you didn't use for something that helped grow the economy, like really productive investment, and just because Congress calls most things investment doesn't make it so. So usually the higher your debt, the worse it is for the economy, though there are times that it makes sense to borrow either for things that are so important or economically justifiable, or you want to smooth out the costs over time. And so much of what affects when it's really going to become a problem is all the different other variables in the economy. So right now in a globalized world, the big issue is we are the safe haven. We are the reserve currency. People buy our debt when the economy is bad, even if we made the economy bad, like last recession, people buy US debt. But the more we run up our debt, the more we have debt, and certainly the more politically unstable we become as well, the less likely that is to last. So basically, there is this ongoing slow frog in the boiling water where we are not using this economic advantage to help us do better things, but instead we're squandering it, which means that that amount of runway for having that benefit will be shorter and shorter. And then there's the risk that something abrupt happens. So China over the weekend said that it thinks if the trade war continues, one of the options they do have is they own $1 trillion in treasuries. Would they flood the market with some treasuries? Remember, I wrote an op-ed about this about 5 or 6 months ago. And most people said, oh, China will never do that. It will hurt them more than it will hurt us, hurt the US. Yeah, but China and US have different time horizons in terms of the strategies that they're using against each other as they are figuring out this new economic relationship. And so it's certainly one of the tactics that could happen. So there are things that, in addition to the slow boil of how this is harming our economy, or as a great economist said, the termites in the basement, there is the risk that something abrupt happens. There is a treasury market auction where there's not enough demand. That can cause a spike in interest rates. Inflation starts to get ahead of us. Doesn't look likely, but that could happen. There's a lot of reasons that could happen. or there's really a shift in currency relationships. Any of those things could happen gradually or abruptly. So 100% doesn't mean anything particular. We used to talk about 60% being the sign of health in this country. That came from the Maastricht Treaty and other sort of conventions. But it's more just we pick an area that we agree on because there's so many other fundamentals in your economy, and how you're doing versus others that really are what dictate how much you can borrow. And we may be able to borrow for an incredibly long time, but it will constantly be having some negative effects in other parts of the economy that might not be as obvious, but mean our standard of living continues to be lower and lower and lower. It's why it's really hard to make a case for this issue, because you can't point to, high healthcare costs, student debt. Like, most issues have the poster child of why it is that you're worried about it. This one is this invisible, basically, like, being over indebted leaves you vulnerable to a whole host of national security and economic security issues. We have just weakened our entire resilience toward all sorts of things that happen to us, but it's not one thing you can point to.
Now, everybody's seen the chart, the charts that have come out when we hit 100%, and the story that the last time this happened was World War II. And it did come down after that, but can you maybe just describe in a big picture, how is the economy and the maturity of the economy today different than it was in the 1950s that will make it tougher to replicate what
Yeah,
we did back
it's
then?
a great question. We're trying to actually do myth busting on that, because a lot of people are saying we've had debt that was this high and we fixed it so quickly, which is true. After World War II, in basically about 4 years, they got control of the debt. Basically, every factor was working in the right direction then and is working in the wrong direction now. So at the time, after the war, they ran balanced budgets for a number of years. We, on the other hand, are going to, even if we do nothing else, run deficits of $1 trillion, growing every year, with the debt growing faster than the economy. That is so far. I mean, in order for us to balance the budget, I don't remember the numbers now, but it's so laughable. We would have to have savings of well over $10 trillion over the next decade. My guess is we have no savings over the next decade. I mean, we haven't saved money on net. We've been borrowing more and more every year, not saving money. So to generate a debt plan that saved you enough money to balance the budget is pretty inconceivable in the environment that we're in. So they had that right after World War II. They had the baby boomers flooding the labor market, and so that they were expanding all sorts of things, and they didn't have the people going into retirement or the big entitlement programs that were draining resources. So we're already on a trajectory that makes it almost impossible for that to happen, and our demographics make it worse. So there've been some really smart people who've said not to worry, this happened right after the war. The really smart people know that's not true. They're worried we'll stop borrowing now, too early in this recession. That's a legitimate worry, but you should explain it for the honest reason, not that you shouldn't worry about a debt this high. The debt this high leaves us very vulnerable.